When Leslie Ford vanished, along with her 4 eldest children, Leslie's brother feared the worst.
I knew that Leslie and the kids were killed, that he'd killed them. I just had that gut feeling.
Abuse had been a permanent feature of Leslie's marriage to Lee Ford.
She just told me that Lee used to beat her and things.
He'd manipulated Leslie for years. He became more controlling of her behaviour, of who she was seeing, of what she was wearing.
Lee Ford was also abusing his stepchildren.
The kids, actually, who they were at school with, was telling us that they used to come in with bruises and things.
My feelings are that he was sexually abusing her.
When Leslie tried to escape the marriage, she paid the ultimate price.
She was going to leave with all the children, and I think he just couldn't take it.
Statistics show that if a female is to die, the likelihood it's going to be at the hands of a partner or ex-partner.
I know he was abusive to my sister, but I didn't think he would actually kill him.
On a cool, early autumn day in 2000, Peter Wyatt received a phone call about his sister, Leslie.
The first I heard that Leslie was missing was one of my uncles phoned me and said, "Leslie with you?" And I said, "No, she's not with me." It was about 2 o'clock in the morning when I phoned the police and reported her missing. Actually, I didn't report her missing. I told the police that he'd killed her.
He was Peter's brother-in-law, Lee Ford. The family of 8 had been living in a bungalow in the village of Carnkye in the west of Cornwall. Lee, Leslie, their 2 young children together, and Leslie's children from her first marriage, Sarah Jane, Anne-Marie, Stephen and Craig.
The last time Leslie and the 4 older children were seen alive was the 31st of August 2000. And over the next days and weeks, Lee Ford started to do things, started to lay down the tracks to make people believe that she'd left him.
I phoned the house a few times, then I did get a phone call back from Lee. He goes, "I know she's with you." And I put her on the phone. And I said, "She's not with me." And I've not seen her. She wasn't there, was she? He knew quite well where she was at the time. But I don't know how someone could talk to you like that.
He actually positioned himself as the victim, saying that Leslie had left him. And he, had been left with their 2 children, and she'd taken off and left with her 4 children from a previous relationship.
He told me that she'd gone off with a guy in a car with the kids, in a very posh car.
The last time I seen Lee Ford, he came in to demand Sarah's wages. He said because they're leaving. And then I started up in my message to Sarah saying, "What's going on? Where are you?" One of my last messages to Sarah was, "Are you still alive?"
He rang the Helston Community College and said the children were ill and couldn't come in. He then apparently picked up the books that the children had at home and things like that, returned them to the school and said they wouldn't be back.
He took all the kids' clothes and stuff around to my mum's at Leslie's. And my mum actually put all the stuff straight up in the attic. She didn't even think about it. And a lot of the evidence was up in my mum's attic. The duvet and bits and pieces with the blood and that on, where he beat Leslie before he killed her. Don't know how anyone could face someone after you've killed their kids, their daughter and their grandkids, really. Lee was actually in touch with one of his ex-girlfriends as well at the time, after he killed Leslie and that, trying to get a relationship back with them.
He killed Leslie and her 4 children, and then calmly moved on to flirting with another woman.
Peter Wyatt did not believe his sister Leslie had simply fled the relationship.
In my heart, actually, I knew where she would have been on my doorstep if she'd left him. Well, Leslie wouldn't have left 4 kids. She would have took all 6. She wouldn't have left without any of her kids.
Family meant everything to Leslie Ford. She and her older brother Peter were always close.
We used to talk on the phone nearly every week, and we were really close. You know, she used to fight my battles at school. If I got picked on, she'd pick on the person who was picking on me. She started me smoking, actually. I caught her smoking when she was younger. And so I threatened her that I was going to tell my parents if she didn't let me have a fag. And that was it. I started at 13, smoking. I carried on and she stopped. But we didn't have an easy childhood anyway. And it was a hard childhood we had.
We don't know very much about Leslie and Peter's upbringing, but Peter does describe it as a very difficult childhood, which gives us a clue that both of them, to some extent, were suffering within it. And I think what that tends to do for siblings is they tend to cling closer together as a survival mechanism. We have each other's backs.
When we had our first child, we used to phone her and she used to tell us what to do, you know. She was really close to me. But Leslie wanted a big family. She loved kids. Our kids were the world to her.
Leslie would soon meet the first love of her life.
Around 1982, Michael Tranter and Leslie Wyatt used to get a bus together in Telford, and that's where they met. Leslie was 18 at the time, Michael was 20.
They started talking on the bus and she started going out with him and things. And then they ended up getting married.
Between 1983 and 1987, Michael and Leslie had 4 children together. The oldest was Sarah Jane, then they had Anne-Marie, then Stephen, and the last one to come along was Craig.
It's a picture of Leslie and Sarah when Sarah was first born. Before she gave birth, when she was in labour, I had to drive up to Mike's and Leslie's house to pick her up and take her into hospital. So that happened with all 4. She was over the moon, with all her kids actually. She was a great mother.
As the children grew, siblings Peter and Leslie remained close.
When I used to go up there and go and visit them, the 2 girls used to bring their hairbrushes to me and get me to brush their hair. And they had nice, lovely long hair. So they used to like me doing it.
After 7 years together, Leslie's marriage to Michael ended in divorce in 1989.
About a year later, Leslie was in a relationship with a man, and I'll describe it as problematic. He was stealing from her. And a man called Lee Ford come along, who seemed to know this man somehow. And a bit like a knight in shining armour, he came along and he threw the man out of the house.
And I think that the role that Lee played in her life at this particular point was almost as a romantic aggressor, protector figure. When you're in a vulnerable situation, you're in a difficult relationship and you're trying to figure out a way out, somebody comes in and says, I will save you. That is highly attractive.
You know, he was offering stability, he was offering calm, he was offering help with her children and love, ultimately. And then red flags did start to present.
He seemed to be okay, seemed to be fine, nice, polite. And that's really all you can ask for at the time, but you just don't know what's behind the person or what's going on behind closed doors, really, do you?
When Peter Wyatt first met his sister Leslie's new partner, Lee Ford, he saw no reason to be worried.
He was very bright, very brainy, very clever. Work-wise, he just potted around. One minute he was working, the next minute he wasn't working.
Leslie and Lee Ford developed a relationship which was quite whirlwind. Within a few short months they were living together, and shortly after that they got married.
The relationship seemed to be alright at the beginning, and then he got very possessive. He wouldn't let her wear certain things and do certain things. And if she'd gone upstairs and put something on and came down and he didn't like it, he'd make her change it.
So his behaviours early on were sort of showing signs of coercive control. He started becoming restrictive with Leslie about who she was seeing and talking to.
It was difficult actually to get Leslie away from him. He was always there with you all the time, and like he was missing out on something.
Ultimately, perpetrators of domestic abuse are doing these behaviours in order to get as much control over the victim as possible. They're controlling what they look like, who they're seeing, and ultimately they're isolating them.
She was quiet with Lee, and she used to go like this with her fingers, and that a lot. And when she used to do this when she was a kid, it was always that she was worried and frightened. And she used to do that quite a bit with Lee around. Like, I better be careful what I say. She hated her photo being taken, so the impression on her face is go away type of thing. Got her fingers in her mouth or biting her nails, and in the background, just lurking over the back end of the sofa, is Lee peering over the back of it. So it's quite a weird photo in some ways.
On the face of it, Lee appeared all right most of the time. And I think also Lee was incredibly good at wearing a mask, of being charming, of looking like a great dad, of looking like a great partner. There are some hints that potentially these are red flags, where Leslie would come down wearing something and Lee would tell her to get changed. This is the early signs of a controlling person. But from Peter's point of view, how much of this did he actually see a lot of the time?
Leslie and Lee got married in 1990. Not long after, Lee became physically violent towards Leslie.
She just told me that Lee used to beat her and things. He used to drink quite a bit, and he used to actually, we think, used to take some drugs as well.
During their relationship, Leslie did try to get out of it. She went to women's refuges, she went to family. She did try and break away from that relationship, which was not healthy.
Peter and his family soon felt they had to protect Leslie from their new brother-in-law.
And my brother actually used to go round and get him out of the house, change the locks and things. I'd actually come from Hampshire all the way to Telford and done the same quite a few times as well. But then 3-4 days later, she'd let him back in.
I think for Peter it was incredibly difficult and frustrating to be on the outside looking in, knowing that his sister was being hit. But I think when you are the person on the outside and you can see what needs to be done, what you don't really see is the complexity and the trauma that's going on for Leslie. She would have been involved in a relationship with someone where she felt that there was love there were children there. It was complex for her to just suddenly go, right, that's it, I'm out.
Leslie just wouldn't be without him. That's the problem. When I knew the violence was happening and he was hitting her around, you know, you can only do so much. If the person won't leave, you can't force them to leave.
Leslie's brother being aware of the behaviour, I think all he could have done was be a support network for Leslie, but ultimately you are at a risk of, if you push yourself into the situation, potentially making it worse, potentially isolating that person further.
I just had enough with her, really, in some ways, and just cut ties with her a little bit.
In 1992, Leslie and Lee had their first child together, who was a son.
Leslie was more tied than ever to her abusive husband, who was now playing father to 5 children.
With the kids, he seemed fine, and the kids seemed fine with him. But then that might have been scared, I don't know. They were very quiet, not like normal kids. They were well behaved all the time. Lee was very good with the kids, playing and things like that. You wouldn't actually think there was anything wrong. They were really jolly. They seemed really jolly playing and things.
I think Lee was incredibly clever at manipulating those around him, because he needed them for his own ego supply, to think he's a great guy, to think he's charming, to think that he's got it all sorted out and all together. And Peter would be looking to those children to go, well, surely I would pick something up that wasn't quite right, or they would tell me. Those children were incredibly self-disciplined because they were terrified of Lee.
It's only after you realise what they might have been going through.
5 years into their marriage, Leslie tried to break away.
Eventually, in 1995, she made the big move. She took her and her 5 children and she moved to Cornwall without telling Lee where she was going.
So she was in Cornwall, actually, in a caravan, on a caravan park for a while. I didn't even know she was in Cornwall, actually, at first.
Leslie didn't tell many people where she'd moved to, but Lee was determined to find out. And he went about it in quite a clever way, actually.
He rang her mother, pretending to be a solicitor, trying to trace her, and he was given the address where the family were living in Bugle.
He manipulated family members, friends, to get the information that he wanted, so that ultimately he could stalk Leslie and the children and obtain her new address, follow her, and convince her to get back with him.
He turned up on her doorstep and then must have persuaded her that he was sorry for what had happened before, and he'd mended his ways. So she took him back in.
After getting his wife back, Ford seemed determined that Leslie would never leave him again. Peter would invite his sister to come and stay with him in Hampshire, 200 miles away from her home with Lee.
The kids were invited as well, and the kids weren't allowed to come. And Leslie did say that to me, that he's kept the kids there to make sure that I go back. So there was that part of him still there, that he was still controlling and possessive and making sure that actually she didn't do a runner from Cornwall, I suppose.
Shortly after Lee and Leslie Ford resumed their relationship, she became pregnant once again.
They had a daughter, so in total they now had 6 children in the house. Then around 1998, they all moved to a place called Conkai.
It was a secluded little bungalow in Conkai.
I would describe it as more a hamlet than a village. It's just a string of houses in a rural area.
Local journalist Colin Gregory became well acquainted with the village after the family was murdered.
I do wonder why somebody would pick Conkai, because in general it's a place with few services, so you wouldn't choose it as a place to live, but you could choose it as a place to hide away. I would think that it was quite possible for Lee and Leslie Ford, together with the 6 children, to move into a place like that without other people being close enough to ask questions as to where they came from and what they were doing. Because basically he was trying to keep low, because I don't think he wanted any of the Tranter family really to know where he was and where the children were.
For years, Leslie's ex-husband Michael had no idea where his 4 children were living, and no one in the local area knew the family's history.
Today, there's joined up thinking, joined up working between all the police forces around the country. So it's easy for somebody from one police force to log onto a computer and see what information is held on someone around the country. But in 2000, that would have been very different. For the police in Cornwall to understand what information Telford police may have held on Leslie and Lee Ford and the family, it would have taken them to physically contact the police that cover Telford and ask for that information. It's not as simple as just logging onto a computer and finding it instantly.
To the untrained eye, the Ford family appeared to settle into the area without incident.
There was nothing on the outside unusual about Lee and Leslie. I don't think Leslie went out much, but people that I spoke to in the area just really described her as a really friendly, nice lady. It was difficult to find out much about him because obviously one thing was I don't think he told much about himself to other people. Lee used to drink quite heavily and used to go to a local cricket club.
He used to go and sit in the garage and watch telly in the garage and things out the way from the rest of the family, I've been told, and that he spent a lot of time there.
He did part-time jobs, so he was a bit of an odd job man, but also he was what they call casual worker at Falmouth Docks.
It's the first time I think I've known him to work, really, and he seemed happy doing it, but he seemed like a normal person, really.
Living in Cornwall, Leslie and Lee Ford seemed to lead a simple life. On the surface, at least, Leslie's children from her first marriage, Sarah Jane, Anne-Marie, Craig and Stephen, appeared to be thriving.
You can see actually from the photographs of them, they seem quite happy, well-adjusted children. Everyone, their friends at the school spoke highly of them.
The kids were very, very quiet around Lee, but they seemed happy. We were out in the garden playing basketball and things, and Lee was there playing it as well, and it seemed like a normal family in some ways, but you knew there was something underlying there still. I always knew that Lee hit Leslie around. I didn't know anything was happening with the kids at all.
So people started to see signs of the children in school that, in hindsight, looking back now, were indications that not was all right in the house. For instance, Anne-Marie not wanting to do sports. Is that because she had bruises on her body that she didn't want people to see? Not being able to go with friends after school to their houses, and feeling that they had to get home quickly, especially when Lee Ford was picking them up.
He was involved with this woman and her children as a way to serve his needs. And as long as he had power and control and he could possess everybody and he jealously possessed them all, he was fine. As soon as anybody spoke up or spoke out, he would beat them into submission.
You don't even think about it really at the time. It's only after you realise what they might have been going through.
Leslie's eldest daughter, Sarah Jane, sought refuge at work.
I knew Sarah for about 2 years. That's when we worked together in McDonald's. We grew closer and closer all the time, and we just become like best friends, and then grew into a relationship. You could tell that was an escape for Sarah to get away from her norm. Sarah always deflated when the shift was coming to the end. She was never happy to be picked up. It was just like the storm was coming in to take her away again.
Exactly what Sarah Jane was going through at home would only become clear later.
In early 2000, things started to take quite a worrying turn. Leslie started to have suspicions that Lee Ford was having sexual relationships with Sarah Jane, who was 17 at the time, and possibly Anne-Marie, who was 15.
Leslie phoned me, and she was concerned that Lee was actually messing around with the girls, and she needed to get away with the kids.
If those sexual abuse allegations are true, then I believe that Ford groomed Sarah Jane and ultimately committed acts of paedophilia and child sexual abuse.
I got hold of the Women's Refuge and got her a place with the kids. I got down there and Leslie said that she wasn't leaving him.
When Peter arrived in Cornwall, Leslie had changed her mind. She told him everything was fine, and she decided she was going to stay in that house with Lee.
Behind the scenes, though, Leslie Ford had decided to take action.
Sarah and Leslie actually went to a solicitor in between the June and when she was killed.
And she expressed to them concern that she had around the violence within their relationship and the potential sexual abuse from Lee Ford on Sarah Jane. And the solicitors actually approached social services and no action was taken.
It takes an awful lot for those victims to speak up and tell anybody because they are terrified. So in a situation like that, you can see that the domestic abuser will escalate and keep escalating because what they've done is they've isolated that victim and taken away any support system that they may have had. So coercive control is one thing, it's terrible, but I think in this situation you can see how it escalated and how Leslie tried everything she could to protect her children, to protect herself.
No one knows if Lee Ford got wind of Leslie's meeting with the solicitor. But if he had, it may help to explain what happened next.
She was about to leave him. She was doing everything she could to get away from him, and he couldn't deal with that.
Everything had to go his way, and suddenly when things weren't going his way, he couldn't handle it.
In late August 2000, Leslie and the 4 eldest children vanished. Sarah Jane's then boyfriend Reese was potentially the last person to see her alive.
The last day I saw Sarah was the day I took my baby son, down to see her. She had my son in her arms, and then her stepdad drove in, and she abruptly passed my son back to me. And then she sort of said her goodbyes and quickly scurried off and rushed off to the car and just jumped into the car. And then as the stepdad drove out of the car park, I remember vividly him looking at me as like he didn't like me. You could tell he didn't like me. And they drove off. I feel like Lee didn't know anything about me until that moment, like properly. I'm convinced Lee wanted to control her, yes.
It's all about him. It's about power. And when you don't do what I want, I will get rid of you and I will move on. And I think that's very much how Ford operated.
A month later, having not heard from Leslie, Peter reported his sister, his niece Sarah Jane, and her 3 siblings missing.
I spoke to Cornwall Police and they went round that was on a Friday.
Officers had been alerted by Mrs. Ford's concerned brother. She was last seen in August and her children hadn't attended school at all this term.
When the police were talking to Peter Wyatt, they would be trying to establish, is this out of the ordinary? Could Leslie have taken the kids and gone somewhere else? Especially if you're in the kind of relationship that she was in, and we know previously she had taken the children and left Lee Ford. But the difference this time was that nobody knew where she was.
And they went round on Saturday morning, and they had an inkling that he'd done it as well when they met him.
Detectives had been quizzing Lee Ford at this police station after he was arrested on suspicion of murder and are continuing to search the couple's bungalow at Carnkey, looking for clues as to what happened to the young mum and her teenage children.
Ford told the police the same story he told his brother-in-law Peter, that his wife and 4 stepchildren had simply left him.
The fact that nobody knew where Leslie was, the fact that she hadn't been in contact with anyone for so long, would definitely have raised the suspicions. When they were looking at the phone usage of the family, there would have been none. Had Leslie made any cash withdrawals? She would have made none. Had she contacted any friends or family? No. The answers to all these questions would have raised their suspicions, would have started to make them really worry for the safety of Leslie and her children. You can't just assume that harm had come to them. But they would also be looking at the fact, had harm come to them? Were they killed? And if they are, what they would then look at is at whose hands. And one of those they would have looked at would have been Lee Ford. Statistics show that if a female is to die, the likelihood is it's going to be at the hands of a partner or ex-partner.
Probably 4 weeks after, Lee Ford must have been feeling quite worried about how police attention was turning to him. And I believe he put the 2 youngest children in a car and took them back took them up to his family in the Telford area.
And on the way back, on the Wednesday, if I'm right, he was arrested for benefit frauds.
Within hours of his arrest, Ford had confessed to murdering his wife Leslie and her 4 eldest children.
Detectives hunting for missing mum Leslie Ford and her 4 children have charged her husband, 33-year-old Lee Ford, with their murders.
In the small Cornish village of Carnkey, police were yet to find the bodies of Leslie Ford and her 4 teenage children. Under questioning, Lee Ford told police his version of what had happened to them.
He had an argument with Leslie, and she was in the bedroom, and he beat her around with a baseball bat. And he went out, actually made her drink, took her some aspirins, and after he beat her around, then he went out into his garage. He seen this piece of rope hanging up in the garage, and he went back in. Then he killed Leslie with the piece of rope around her neck. Then he killed the kids one by one. It's very hard to even thinking of what they went through. Did they know that they were going to die or not? We don't know if all the kids were in the house at the same time and they were in their rooms and he called them out. Just don't know.
While Ford was making his confession, the police got a warrant to search the family's home in Carnkey.
The forensic team and the police went into the bungalow, and I had a phone call from the police, and we drove straight down to Cornwall then. So we just sat and waited to hear what was going on.
I remember I was walking into work, and I remember my colleagues saying to me, "Have you heard?" I had said, "Heard what?" And then they told me that the first set of bodies had been discovered in the woodshed.
Having carried out these killings, Lee had to decide what he was going to do with the bodies. He decided to take them out into the back garden where they had a woodshed, and he buried them under the wood, wrapped in bed sheets.
Leslie's body and the two boys were found there. At the time, there was no sign of the bodies of the two girls.
In my heart, I was praying to God and believing that she seen what had happened, she'd run and survived.
They found the bodies of the three, and they had to. Then Lee actually took them and showed them where he buried the other bodies. Luckily, or they might have been completely gone.
He took Sarah Jane's body and Anne-Marie to about 4 or 5 miles from where they lived, and he buried them in a potato field. When the bodies were discovered, they'd been there for about 5 weeks. It was summer, and Lee Ford had taken steps by using lime to try and speed up the decomposition process. So the bodies wouldn't have been in a state where they'd be easily recognisable as to who was who.
I can't remember exactly how I found out Sarah had died and their bodies had been found. But I do remember being completely inconsolable. I remember being able to barely breathe, and even finding that out, I was still wishing it was a mistake, hoping they got the wrong person.
You just don't know what to believe. You're hoping that you're wrong, but in your gut you know that you're right. And you hear this on the news. I heard it before this, families are being murdered and things like this, and you think, God, how do they cope with it? How do they get through it? It's very hard. Even 20 odd years later, it's still hard to think that they're not here. They would have had kids by now as well, her kids. She would have been a granny. It's very difficult, and especially kids being killed. There was no need to kill the kids.
An important part of establishing how the family died would have been the post-mortem. The forensic pathologist said that these killings were carried out expertly and efficiently, which comes back to Lee Ford's state of mind. Was he in a rage or was he in control?
This was an almost strategic, one-by-one killing. He also said that none of the victims were aware of the other victim. That none of them knew before they were murdered that the rest of their family had been. So if he's paying attention to that kind of level of detail and making sure, I don't want that child to know that their sibling has died or their mother has been murdered, then that kind of, to me, implies like a level of rational thought that's going on throughout this, and a strategic planning of locations of where these things are happening.
He wasn't running around like a lunatic. He was in control of his actions.
You trust people in your family, and it's hard to believe. I know he's abusive to my sister, but I didn't think he would actually kill him. We're all human beings, and we've all got a soul, and you think, God, how can anyone do that to kids?
On the 24th of May 2001, having pleaded guilty to all 5 murders, Lee Ford was handed 5 life sentences, and he was given a minimum sentence of 27 years, which means that he would have to serve 27 years before he could apply for parole.
I think 27 years for 5 people is ridiculous. It's a stupid sentence. It's not 5 life sentences. It's not even 1, I don't think. Leslie and the kids did have a life, but they're not no more. Because they were taken by someone who they thought would look after them. And they didn't. And why should he have a life in 27 when they still haven't got a life?
Ford's guilty plea meant he was never compelled to explain why he'd murdered his wife and stepchildren.
He's the only one who knows the truth.
I think Lee Ford pleaded guilty so that the details of various things would not come out in court. He didn't want the fact that he'd had an inappropriate relationship with his stepdaughter, not just inappropriate, illegal, in fact, read out.
Ford never explained his actions. He confessed his guilt, but he never explained the lead-up. He never explained the details of what happened. And call me cynical, but I see that as Ford's last ultimate act of control, because he's still controlling the narrative. They are no longer around to share their tales of what happened that day. By withholding that information, he is controlling the narrative. And in some ways, he's still therefore got control over Leslie, Sarah Jane, Anne-Marie, Craig, and Stephen.
Or whatever happened with Sarah. I think that was the last straw, really, when Leslie found out and it was going further and Leslie was going to leave him.
His control is about possessiveness. You do what I tell you to do, otherwise you don't live anymore. So he did that.
This one is the kid's grave and the headstone, which is black, and all four children are buried together.
The memorial service was at Truro Cathedral. There were the four small coffins down in front of the altar, and you just thought, this is terrible. There are four lovely kids who've lived a happy young life, and not only have their lives been robbed, but their grandparents, relations, and to some extent their younger brother and sister have been robbed of that.
At the funeral, journalist Colin met Michael Tranter, the father of the four murdered children.
He was in a terrible state. He just said, everything's been taken away from me. These four children were all I lived for, and now I've been robbed of that.
I took Mike down to Cornwall about a year or so ago, and we went back round and visited the places and where the kids were buried in the potato field and things as well. It was good. They've got the Remembrance Garden at the school, which is very nice. Me and Mike actually planted some new flowers there as well when we were there. And the parish actually have built a remembrance park there for the kids as well, with a name on a plaque in bits and pieces and that. So it's really nice to go back and see that they're still remembered.